Today's reading comes from the second chapter of 1 Samuel, but before I read it, I just want to tell you a little bit of background. So this is Hannah's prayer of thanksgiving and joy, and she's praying this because she went to God and prayed for a child, and God answered her prayer and gave her a child, and then she responded by giving that child back to God, by actually making him a priest. And so this is kind of Hannah's response. After all of that has happened and God has been faithful in her life, she's praying this prayer. From 1 Samuel 2. Hannah prayed and said, "My heart exalts in the Lord. My strength is exalted in my God. My mouth derides my enemies because I rejoice in my victory. There is no holy one like the Lord, no one besides you. There is no rock like our God. Talk no more so very proudly. Let no arrogance come from your mouth, for the Lord is a God of knowledge, and by him actions are weighed. The bows of the mighty are broken, but the feeble gird on strength. Those who were full have hired themselves out for bread, but those who were hungry are fat with spoil. The barren has borne 7, but she who has many children is forlorn. The Lord kills and brings to life. He brings down to Sheol and raises up. The Lord makes poor and makes rich. He brings low and he also exalts. He raises up the poor from the dust. He lifts the needy from the ash heap to make them sit with princes and inherit a seat of honor. For the pillars of the earth are the Lord's, and on them he has set the world. This is the word of the Lord. Will you please pray with me? Speak, O Lord, in words that we can hear. Open our hearts to your word, and plant the light of your grace deep in our hearts. Amen. In the Harry Potter books and movies, the term mudblood means dirty blood, and it's this deeply offensive term for someone who doesn't have magical parents. And those of you who are Harry Potter fans, you have to help me out here. Tell me after the service if I'm getting this right, because I looked and I looked. For the first time that term is used, and I think it's in the second movie or the second book when the Gryffindor and Slytherin Quidditch teams both want to practice at the same time. And main character Hermione stands up for her team. But another character named Draco doesn't like that. And so he gets this smug look on his face and he says, "No one asked you, you filthy mudblood." And I know I don't do a Draco accent very well, but that's okay. You can teach me later. And unfortunately for Hannah, she too was looked down upon for something that was totally out of her control. And I'm going to rewind a bit and tell you a bit more about Hannah's story before we get to today's reading. Because you see, Hannah couldn't have any children. And so the practice at the time, and what likely happened to her, is that in response, her husband went out to go get a second wife, and one who could bear children. And that practice, in and of itself, is pretty telling. You can imagine what that would feel like. And then to make matters worse, Hannah had a Draco. It was that second wife. The story says that not only did she have lots and lots of children, but she took every opportunity she could find to rub it in Hannah's face. So when one day Hannah is really distraught, she's weeping, she's not eating anymore, her husband comes up to her and he comforts her with these words, "Hannah, why is your heart so sad? Am I not more to you than 10 sons?" Pretty much not so much, right? No one understands Hannah. So what does Hannah do? She goes right to God And when you and I come up against a situation so difficult that we just don't know what to do, we too need to be in the practice of bringing those things right to God, which is exactly what the disciples do in the gospel reading that we had this morning. It's in our earlier service. It's the story of the feeding of the 5,000. In that story, Jesus goes to the disciples and tells them to feed 5,000 plus people. But the disciples look at what they've got. Just 5 loaves and 2 fish in their hands, and they tell Jesus the truth. They have no idea how to do that. They don't have enough food. What Jesus is asking for is impossible. Some might say, why don't the disciples have more faith here? But I think this is faith, and exactly the right kind of faith. Faith that goes right to Jesus. Better this honesty than walk away with 5 loaves and 2 fish in your hands and no idea how you're going to do what Jesus has just asked. Just imagine the scene. The disciples are talking with Jesus, and they say, okay, we'll take care of feeding everyone. And then they turn around and try to divide each of those loaves into 1,000 pieces. Everyone would get like a little tiny quarter of a crumb, if that. And then the crowd would walk away hungry. And we know that Jesus doesn't want that. So here's the thing. God doesn't need us to put on a good show for him. God doesn't need us to pretend that everything makes sense when it doesn't. What God does need is us. Because you know what happened in the story of the feeding of the 5,000. When the disciples bring their measly 5 loaves and 2 fish and hand them over to Jesus, when they bring their confusion and their questions and hand those over to Jesus, well, Jesus goes right ahead and turns measly into abundance. And Jesus just has a way of doing that. And Hannah seems to know that. So Hannah prays. She pours out her heart to God. But in the midst of it, Hannah also does something that I wouldn't suggest. In her desperation, she makes a bargain with God. God, if you'll give me a baby boy, then I'll give that child right back to you. Come on, God, please? And this kind of bargaining is pretty common, especially when we reach that point of desperation. We'll do anything to get what we want. But the problem is, God just doesn't work that way. God isn't like a vending machine where you can look in and you can clearly see there are 5 packages of M&Ms in there. And you know exactly what you need to do to get those M&Ms out. You got to put in your 75 cents, right? But you see, God's goodness and God's faithfulness just aren't in limited supply like that. God isn't standing up in heaven with 5 packages of faithfulness and goodness looking out for the 5 people here today who have the very best prayers so he can pass them out and leaving everyone else high and dry. As Pastor Tim reminded us last week, all of our names are written on the palm of God's hand. And God remembers all of his children. So we can see that Hannah gets some things right, and other things not so much. But nonetheless, God answers Hannah, and she has a baby boy. Now we know that God doesn't always answer us in the way we want, but in Hannah's case, he does. And now, after promising to give her child away, to essentially live at the temple and become a priest, there are a few different ways that this could go. Hannah could pretend that She doesn't know anything about that bargain with God. What are you talking about? Or she could try to reason with God. Well, God, I really didn't mean it when I said that. And, you already have a lot of really good priests, and I don't think Samuel would make a very good one anyway, so let's just forget about it. Or she could choose to give her son away, but be really, really mad at God in the process. But Hannah walks down none of these paths. The story goes that as soon as Hannah finished weaning Samuel, she went to the temple and left her only son there for the Lord. Just like that. And that takes us to the reading for today, Hannah's prayer. And even though the story says that Hannah prays, a lot of people think that because of the format, this is actually a song to be sung. So, as Hannah has just given away her only son, she has a song on her lips, a spring in her step. It's not quite what we'd expect. And here are the words she's singing. My heart exults in the Lord. There is no holy one like the Lord. No one besides you. There is no rock like our God. Or if you head to a different version called The Message, it translates the first line this way. I'm bursting with God news. Bursting. And I actually think that captures Hannah's state well. I think it might just be that Hannah is so grateful for this gift that she's been given that she can't help but give and give and give. Even her son. God is teaching Hannah how to have eyes to see his faithfulness. Can't you just imagine that this is a story that Hannah will keep right on telling again and again until the day she dies? And every time people gather around her to hear that story, they'll walk away thinking, I want more of whatever it is that she has. And yet even as Hannah is singing this song, she still doesn't know the full impact of what she's just done, the full impact of giving away her son. You see, the people of God had reached a crossroads at this point. They had stopped listening to God, and they had even started worshiping other gods again. Hannah didn't know that at a time when even the priests were having a lot of trouble hearing from God, that her son Samuel would be one who truly listened for God's voice. She didn't know that he would be the one to stand up and call the people to turn back to God, that he would anoint 2 kings, and that one of those would be King David. And Hannah most certainly could not have known that Samuel's impact as a priest would be so great that he would have 2 entire books of the Bible named after him. Hannah didn't know. And neither can we know the full impact of each little thing that we do. And yet, God is so very faithful, and in much bigger ways than we can even imagine. Never mind the fact that all this comes out of just one itty-bitty little story in Hannah's life. Just imagine if we had the whole story. And yet Hannah is not so very different from us. All she was doing was being herself and trying to be faithful. She was praying a prayer, singing a song, sharing a gift in a messy, imperfect sort of way. And fortunately for us, God can do a lot with that. Amen.